Okay. We're going to come back to that. Don't let me forget to come back to that. It's going to...
Can I ask a question of what we just read?
Sure.
Because there's something that's confusing there for me.
Okay.
Because in the Bible that I have, it doesn't say that God says that you will call me I am who I am. God says, he says, go also and say to Moses, say, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Go assemble the leaders of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers. Now, are we to call him the Lord, or is it the great I am?
Yeah, so does everybody know where Randy's reading from? So if you look at the reference here, it's Exodus 3, 14 and 15, right?
Right on cover.
Okay. So if you open your Bibles to Exodus 3, 14, 15. Does anybody need a Bible? Does anybody want a Bible? Okay. Right? So in this version of the Bible, the New Revised Standard Version, this is how it reads. God said to Moses, I am who I am. There's actually a pun that's going on here that the name puns on the divine name of Yahweh, and in the present context would seem to connote being there for Moses and the Israelites. So I'm going to be there for all of you. It's a sort of wordplay that's going on there, right? That's one way to translate the text there. I am who I am. I'm going to be there for you. And he said further, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my title for all generations. Now, listen to the way that Randy's translates this, right? Because you're going to start to see the differences in translation. Go ahead.
No, it's just like he says there, he keeps saying, the Lord, the God of your fathers. God is speaking of himself when he's saying the Lord.
Yes.
And I'm not sure whether he's saying, I want you to call me Lord, or you want to be called the great I am.
Well, so when he's talking about being called Lord, right? That's not a proper name. That's a designation, right? So it'd be like calling somebody king, right? King or Mr. President or Senator or something along those lines, right? But there's also a name that distinguishes this particular one, right? This particular one. And that would be Yahweh, right? So Yahweh is the I am. That's a little bit different than Lord, right? Lord is part of who he is, but there's more to him than that. Does anybody else have a different way of reading that in their translation? Beyond I am.
Father?
Huh?
Father? I don't know.
He's sometimes called that, yes.
El Shaddai.
El Shaddai, yeah.
Prior to this.
Yes. Right, we're going to hear different names for God, but this is one where he's basically saying, I am, right? And again, part of God saying I am is a theological statement as well, right? What do you think he might mean by that? Before all else was, I am. All things come out of me. There is no other necessary, there is no other original being in the universe. All things came into creation through me. I am. That's part of what he's getting at here, right? And this name is so sacred This name is so sacred that the people of Israel, even to present day, won't say it, right? Won't say, right? They will refer to him as Lord. They won't even spell it out, right? They won't even spell it all the way out. It's too sacred to say, right? I am. So we're going to hear a little bit in this passage from Egypt to Canaan. There's a lot going on here, right? There's a lot going on here. In this particular chapter, chapter 4 here, we've got this journey from Egypt to Canaan, right? Who are some of the main characters in this?
Moses and Aaron.
Okay, Moses and Aaron, definitely, right? We've got a pretty long story going on here with a lot of different wrinkles to it. Yeah? Tell me some of the major parts. He breaks it down, Griggs breaks it down into about 20 different sort of sections. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Okay. Why do you suppose it would be important to sort of know these different sections? To be able to break this story up into sections that are identifiable, that we can recognize and sort of know the broad theme of. Why would that be important?
As a guide for the oral tradition, I guess.
Okay, it's a guide for the oral tradition. We can remember the different parts of the story, remember the order in which they happen, right?
God has a plan.
God has a plan.
Step by step it comes.
Okay, step by step it comes. Let's look at some of the major themes in these. For instance, one of them is about Moses' birth and his early years. Right? What can you tell me about Moses' birth and his early years?
He was wet.
What? He got wet. Okay. Yeah, sure, right? We've got the story of Moses and the bulrushes, right? Tell me more, though. There's got to be more to it than that.
It's a setup.
It's a setup?
Yep, they put them out in the bulrushes because the mother knows that's where the, whatever her name is the Pharaoh's daughter. When she comes down here to bathe, that's one of the places she comes. So it isn't like it just, I don't gather that was just meant to happen. It was set up. So, and then what do they say? Well, somebody's got to take care of him. She's looking for somebody, so it's his mother. They get his mother to keep raising him.
Yeah, we've got this whole, and why put the baby in the water anyway? What's going on?
They want to kill them all.
Okay, right? So the ruler at the time wants to kill all the male babies of the Hebrews,
Yes.
right? Of the Hebrews, wants to kill all the male babies of the Hebrews. The ruler at the time wants to do that. And Moses, right? Moses is basically put into the water, right? Passes through the water into what? What's that?
Into the weeds.
Well, basically into the weeds, into the reeds, right? And he's going to be saved improbably by the daughter of the very ruler who is trying to wipe him out. Interesting. Interesting. Can Moses do anything to save himself?
No.
No. Do you suppose at some point or another Moses is told the story of being put in the water and he passes through the water into deliverance?
No, he had more important things.
I'm sure growing up his mother had to tell him.
His mother probably told him that story. Interesting. Interesting.
How else would he know if he was Hebrew if she didn't tell him?
Right. So we've got this time where Pharaoh's getting ready to kill you, right? And he can't kill you because you pass through the water and then you are improbably saved. Huh. Does that ever happen any other time in Moses' life?
Parting
At the Red Sea.
And does Moses remember that as he's standing there before the sea?
Probably.
Well, I don't know, but it seems to me like it's a possibility. that he may remember that may come to him. There are times where I think we've did anybody ever think about that before I brought it up to you?
Nope.
Huh.
Another interesting thing right in the same story, which I didn't know before, God, it says in here that after he went to tell Jethro that he was going to go back to Egypt. Remember when he went to tell his father-in-law because God had already spoken to him?
Mhm.
It says God had intended to kill Moses, but he didn't. Why was he going to kill him?
Don't know. Not sure.
That's what his Bible says. He thought you
I was confused. I wonder if you had an answer for that one.
No, I don't, honestly. I'd have to dig into it a little bit and look again, because honestly, I'd kind of forgotten about that detail. And again, we're in these big themes, right? And then over the course of Moses' life, it's important for us to have a sense of the different moves that go on. So that's just one particular piece, right? Moses' birth and his early years. Let me show you why this gets really important. Turn to Matthew, the beginning of Matthew. In the first chapter of Matthew, what are we talking about?
Genealogy of Jesus.
Genealogy of Jesus, and anything else?
Mentions David. Yeah, they talk about two groups of 14 generations.
Okay, we've got two groups of 14 generations. And if we look in the beginning of Exodus, right? If we look in the beginning of Exodus, we're getting basically, right? We're setting a story. We're setting a story about a person who is going to be identified by God to basically deliver his people, right? Deliver his people. Now that birth in those early years have some interesting parallels to the birth story of Jesus. When we look in Matthew to see what's going on in these first couple of years, and we see Jesus is born, right? And then we hear about, interestingly enough, by the second chapter, we hear about an evil king who wants to kill the babies, and so the family has to flee to Egypt. Moses' birth, early years. Jesus' birth, early years. Matthew may be trying to tell us something in the way that he tells the story about Jesus. Matthew is going to invite a direct comparison between Jesus and Moses. He tells the story in a particular way so that you are thinking about the Exodus story even as you hear the story of Jesus from Matthew. It's going to happen again and again and again. And we can only see that if we're able to break down the Exodus story into some main parts where the themes emerge, right? Let's take a look and see how this keeps on going. So when Moses is called by God to return to Egypt, right? He offers all kinds of excuses, right? He offers all kinds of excuses about why he's not the right one. Yeah? Okay. Now, Jesus, on the other hand, right? Jesus, on the other hand, when we see him in Matthew, right? When we see him in Matthew, chapter 3, verse, let's go to basically 13. We can go to 13. 3:13. We have this baptism of Jesus. The baptism of Jesus. This is basically Jesus being called, right? Jesus being called to basically lead the people, just like Moses is. But the encounter is very different. The encounter is very different, right? Whereas Moses throws up all kinds of excuses, doesn't seem to really know what's going on, right? Jesus says, right? What?
He says, I need to be baptized.
He is embracing the call. He is embracing the call at this point and the anointing that's going to come through this baptism, right? Whereas Moses hems and haws, Jesus goes right up to it and says, let it be so, right? Whereas Moses pauses at the Red Sea and says, I don't know if this is going to work, Jesus goes right on in, right? And what does God say? This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. And then Matthew moves us immediately, right? Moves us immediately into what?
Temptation.
The temptation narrative. Does that sound at all like anything we've seen in Exodus? The people go into the wilderness for how long?
The golden calf.
40 years.
40 years. Matthew tells us immediately that Jesus is in the wilderness for
40 days.
40 days and 40 nights, and he is fasting, right? During that time, all he has access to is the food that's provided to him by God, right? All he has access to is the food that's provided to him by God, and yet he's able to spend that whole 40 days fasting. And is Jesus hungry? Yes, he is hungry. Is he complaining?
No.
No. How do we know that? Because he has an encounter with Satan, where Satan tries to tempt him in a way that the Israelites were also tempted during their Exodus journey, right? For 40 years, basically. Jesus' answer is different.
Man shall not live by bread alone.
Okay, yeah, right? Matthew is inviting a direct comparison. But we're going to miss it if we're not paying attention to these broad themes. If we don't know the story, and right? One of the things to see when Jesus is basically making his responses back and forth to Satan, where is he quoting from? Old Testament, right? And he's quoting exactly from these same sort of temptations that we've already seen before. We know these before. We've seen them. Jesus answers differently. Jesus answers better than Moses does. Part of what Matthew is telling us in this, the way that he tells his story in the Gospel of Matthew is, every time Moses, right? Every time Moses, we hear a detail about Moses and the way that he led the people out and, right, his anointing by God, all of that stuff. Every time there's a comparison, Jesus is better. That's kind of a big deal. How do the people of Israel view Moses during Jesus' time?
As their leader. And
He's the great one. He's the great one. He's the one that was picked by God to lead us out of Egypt and free us and deliver us into this land. They have a very elevated view of Moses. And yet Matthew's saying, yeah, but here's Jesus. And he's so much superior. So much superior. Right? In this temptation narrative, he doesn't fall prey to the things that eventually would keep Moses out of the promised land. Yeah?
Jesus always has the answers, Moses doesn't.
Right. In many ways. Right? What other, if we keep going through Matthew, after this temptation narrative, right after the temptation narrative in chapter 4, what happens after the temptation narrative, starting with 4 verse 12?
Starts preaching.
Okay, he starts preaching.
And he calls his disciples.
Okay, how many?
12.
Huh. Huh.
12 tribes of Israel.
Huh. And these 12, if we do any sort of investigation of their backgrounds, is it a diverse group?
Yes.
Yes.
Very.
Very. It covers a wide survey of different people, socioeconomically, religiously, really covering the span, all different walks of life. All different walks of life. Right? Following Jesus. Yeah? Okay. So, and they're going to follow him where exactly? Wherever he goes. They're going to follow him wherever he goes, and he's going to travel around, right, throughout the countryside, mostly not going into. What's that?
Samaria.
Okay, right? And so they're following him around, and these crowds are, accruing, coming to him, and some interesting miracles happen. Like what?
Healing the sick.
Healing the sick. Anything else?
Carrying the wine.
Okay, yeah.
Driving out demons.
Driving out demons. Feeding people. That match up with any sort of themes that we see in the Exodus story?
You notice next he goes to the mount, just like Moses goes to the mount.
Yes, right? Right? We have this passage where Jesus goes up on a mountain. Now, Luke is going to tell that a little bit differently, right? But Matthew is inviting this Moses comparison again and again, so he's going to tell it that way, right? Again and again. When Jesus gives his Beatitudes, his teaching from the Mount, right? What's that inviting a direct comparison with? The Ten Commandments. He's going to take those same themes that we get in the Ten Commandments and he's going to take them a little further.
Right.
He's going to unpack them and explain a little bit further. Does that make sense? Okay. We have miraculous healings in the time of Jesus. We have miraculous healings in the time of Moses. We have God speaking to his people from a mountaintop in the time of Moses and in the time of Jesus. Right? We have the people being confused about what these signs and wonders mean in the time of Moses and in the time of Jesus. Yeah? We've seen this story before. We've seen it before. We've seen it before. And where does it go next? Right? Matthew is inviting us to think about where this goes next. Where this ultimately ends up is, do the people with Moses enter into the promised land during God's time, or does something else happen? How does the story go?
God decides that they're not going to go, and the next generation is the ones that are allowed to go.
Yeah, they won't quite do it. God takes them to the verge and they just won't quite do it. They're too afraid. Right? Time and again, when we see Jesus talking to the people, right, the crowds that are around him, time and again, one of the things that will happen is, come and follow me, and people will say, yeah, there's this reason. Have we seen this before? Yes. Right? What about the 12, right? So what about the 12? This period where spies are sent to explore Canaan. How many of them are there?
12.
And they're sent into Canaan to do what?
Spires to land.
Okay. Wonder if Matthew has a corollary. Anybody? Take a look at Matthew 10.
Don't let them dirty the hands.
Sends out the 12. Sends out the 12 into the land with good news. Sends them in with good news. Is it is it always going to be welcoming the reception that they get? No, right? Do they have a whole bunch of possessions and households with them as they go out to do this? No. Looks kind of like spies all over again. Yeah? Now, when they come back, and he even says, right, see, I'm sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves. Right? What's that sound like? Sounds like a dangerous mission. Sounds like a dangerous mission. Just like these spies. Matthew is inviting, again, this same sort of thing, right? Now, when the disciples go out and do all of this, Jesus basically sort of tells them what they're going to encounter, right? He tells them the sort of reception that they're going to get. Yeah? He tells them that. It's going to look a lot like what the people of Israel do when they get to the verge of the promised land. They just won't go. They just won't quite do it. Right? But there will be some that these 12 will get through to. Are you starting to see how this works? It's important to know the story and the sort of broad themes of it and the way that it sort of goes, because once you've heard this story, you understand better the story that Matthew's telling you. Right? And it's also important because Matthew is going to tell it to you a little different than Luke. And why would that be? We should be curious about that. Mark is going to tell it to you a little bit different than the other two. And why would that be? Right? We should get curious about that. Because each one's lifting something a little bit different up. A little bit different up. In Matthew, you're going to see Jesus compared to Moses again and again and again and again and again. But whereas Moses can't take the people all the way into the promised land, in Matthew, he does. Whereas Moses fails many times when he's put to the test, and the people fail when they're put to the test, Jesus never does.
Do we really appreciate the pressure that Moses was under when God said to Moses, I was thinking about this last night, and I said to myself, if God came to me in a dream and said, I'd like you to go to North Korea, talk to the president of North Korea, and here's what I want you to tell him, would I be able to do that?
Yeah, right? Or would we start throwing up things like Moses does, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not great at public speaking.
I don't know if I can do that.
Right?
The pressure of going, he and Aaron, imagine that what's going through their mind is they're going to see the Pharaoh. I mean, it's a big man they're going to go see.
Yeah.
This is a real scary thing.
Yes. And God equips them,
Yes.
right? That's one of the things. God meets Moses where he is and equips him to do this, right? For each one of those things. Even when God gets a little frustrated with Moses, maybe he gets frustrated with us from time to time, he still helps, doesn't he? Right? And even when the people again and again and again, right, can't seem to get it together, what? He continues to be with them. He continues to try to save them from themselves. The Ten Commandments aren't for God. They're for us. Because we wander around like guys who won't stop at the gas station to ask for directions. I got this. I know what I'm doing. I'll find it eventually. We just need to drive faster. Right? They're for us. They're for us to get it together. And Jesus' disciples, do you suppose that they are going to run into some of the same problems that the people of Israel do? Sure they are. Sure they are. Matthew's telling the story that what we see in the disciples is no different than what we've already seen with the people before. It's going to take somebody greater than Moses to get us where we need to go. Yeah? It's going to take somebody greater than Moses. And so that's the story that Matthew's telling. And that's the story that we have a hard time with until we actually see the broader themes from the Old Testament to understand why it hasn't been completed yet. Right? The Old Testament, Jesus is quoting back and forth to Satan from the Exodus event. That's what he's doing. He's basically saying, I've seen this before. I know this story. I know this story before that Exodus event. Right? But why do you suppose Jesus quotes and says it is written? Why would he do that?
I think that he felt that people didn't trust him, and he needed to reference back to something that was something they knew.
Well, I mean, he's definitely basically saying, you know, this has already been asked and answered, right? This has already been asked and answered. That comes from Jesus is doing what's basically rabbinical teaching at this point. In the history of all the rabbis, right? Quoting back and forth this knowledge of the story of the covenants, right? So when you ask me a question, similar to the way that we do constitutional law, right? When you do constitutional law, you are going to quote various parts of the Constitution, yeah, right? Because you're going to cite precedents, right? Jesus is citing the appropriate precedents here, right? He knows this. He's seen this before.
He's fulfilling whatever was said before, is that right?
He's fulfilling it, right? Yes, we've been here before. We've seen this thing before. This isn't happening again.
Well, if he can pull scripture out or a story out, it gives him some credibility.
Yes. Now, interestingly, in Luke's gospel, right, the third time, each time in Matthew's gospel, Jesus says it is written, and then he gives the quote. In Luke's gospel, the third time that this happens, this back and forth happens, it reads a little bit different. In Luke's gospel, the last one, Jesus says to Satan, basically, it is said. It is said. In Luke's gospel, it's a little bit snarkier, back and forth between the two of them. I think what Luke is telling us at that point is Jesus is just basically laying it out on the table and basically saying, right? Not just it is written. I'm not just quoting. I'm the one who said it. Just so we're clear. I'm the one who said it. Just so we're clear about who I am and who you are and how that works. Right? And what is Satan's response to that? I'm getting out of here. I'm leaving. I now realize exactly who you are. Right? One of the things that's important, I think one of the things that's important to indicate to us is Satan doesn't know everything. Doesn't. Satan is not omnipotent. He may know an awful lot of things, but he is not omnipotent. Right? And so he leaves. And in that story, whether you're in Matthew or whether you're in Luke, it's important to recognize he's leaving, but he's coming back around again. Right? But this next time that he's going to come around and try to get at Jesus, he's going to try to get at him how? Oh, we should be curious about that. Right? If you put I think it was a Russian, maybe it was, I don't know. There's a Russian author that once said, if you put a gun on the table in chapter 1, you have to do something with it by the end of the book. You can't just put details in there like that and not address them. Right? We should be curious about where Satan's going to show up again.
At the crucifixion. Is that the next
Crucifixion,
time?
yeah.
Yeah.
Even before that.
Yeah,
Even before that. How's he going to get at him? What way is he going to get at Jesus?
when Peter was talking to him, he says, "Get thee behind me, Satan."
Oh. That's where a concordance can be useful, right? So we see this name, and we want to see where it pops up again. Let's see where it pops up again in this particular gospel, right? It's worth paying attention to. Yeah? This is the story of the people, right? And it doesn't just end with Moses. It carries on. What can you tell me about? We got to go quick, I know. What can you tell me about Joshua?
Fought the battle of Jericho.
Okay, he fought the Battle of Jericho, right? Yeah, Joshua is courageous, right? Joshua is this courageous leader that gets anointed by Jesus to basically lead the people, or anointed by Moses to lead the people. Jesus, does he pick anybody in particular who's kind of courageous and going to lead?
Peter.
Huh.
And yet Peter denies 3 times.
Yeah.
He knows Jesus.
Does Joshua ever have a couple moments where he falters? I wonder. Might be worth paying attention to, right? Again, if you're going to understand the New Testament, you got to understand the Old. If you're going to understand the meaning of Easter, you better understand the Exodus and the Passover, because it's all packed in there. Yeah? Okay. Next week, we'll be into 5, chapter 5, Joshua to Nehemiah.